All right. Good morning, everyone. I see folks are still filtering into the Zoom room, but let's go ahead and get started because I want to have as much time as possible for our conversations with the leadership of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System. So welcome. I'm Sujan Jez, and I'm the CEO of California Competes. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll explore user-centered design principles and their crucial role in shaping the development of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System. But before we step further into this discussion, let's take care of a few housekeeping items. Should you have any questions during the session, please simply click on the Q&A button and put your questions in there. We will answer those that we can answer while we go, and then we will also look to those for our Q&A at the end of this webinar. And rest assured, we will send slides and the recording to everyone who registered for the event. And they'll also be posted on our website, californiacompetes.org. So I'd love to begin this discussion by learning more about who joined us for this discussion today. The California Cradle-to-Career Data System aims to be a system that will be utilized by all stakeholders across the education to work continuum. Policymakers, leaders, and experts from K-12, higher ed, research, philanthropy, business community. Where do you fall in this education and workforce system? And note, you can check more than one box. Student, early care, K-12, higher ed, employer industry, workforce development, policy legislative, research, philanthropy, and other, because I'm sure there is some categories that we have missed. And would also love to know, how do you envision you'll use the Cradle-to-Career Data System when it's launched? And if there's an answer that you don't see included, put it in the chat so we can learn more. So we've included some of the main things that the data system anticipates: planning for college for yourself or someone you care for, helping students that you teach, analyzing data to understand opportunities in our state, informing policy change or other. Okay, I see the responses are still actively coming in. Looks like they're slowing, so I'm going to end the poll so we can all see the responses. I know that was fast. So what do we see here and who's attending? Largely 44% from higher ed, about 20% from research, 27% in the policy field, about another quarter in K-12. Thank you all for joining us. Looks like we have a handful of students also. Great. And I see about 18% represent or marked other. I would love to know where you're coming from if you want to put it in the chat. And then, how do you envision using the Cradle-to-Career Data System? So most of the folks joining us this webinar, 83% say analyzing data, understand opportunities. Great. Another 69% to inform policy change. And then 19% marked other. Would also, again, love to know what you plan to use the data system for if you want to put it in chat and share with us. Great. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that. All right, so what are we going to do in our conversation today? I'll provide a short overview of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System, talk a little bit about user-centered design and lessons that California Competes learned as we developed our California Post-Secondary to Prosperity Dashboard. And then we'll jump into a discussion with the California Cradle-to-Career Data System Leadership Executive Director, Marianne Bates, and Ryan Estrellado, who leads the user-centered design and data work. And then we'll have a Q&A with the folks here. And I will do Marianne and Ryan's full bios shortly. And for those who aren't familiar, who's California Competes? So California Competes, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that aims to solve the state's most pressing social and economic problems by conducting rigorous higher education and workforce policy research. We use this research to guide decision makers and policymakers in designing and implementing solutions that strengthen our economy and help our communities thrive. We view higher education as both a vaccine and an antidote against economic stagnation and social stratification for individual Californians, our communities, and the state's economy. We believe California's long-term economic growth will be accomplished through shared prosperity. So how do we focus on those big issues? We've identified 4 key issue areas. 1 is aligning higher education and workforce. 2, improving college access and success for adult learners. 3rd, having more effective and accessible online education opportunities. And 4th, coordinated policy setting and implementation, including the launch of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System. If you want to know more about any of our policy priorities, go to our website and you can read much more about them. Great. So what are we all here for? To talk about, learn about, think about, engage with each other around the launch of this new data system. So what is this data system and why are we building it now? Well, California has a number of regions, cities, areas that hold an enormous amount of wealth and opportunity, but that's not the reality for other parts of our state. We're at once one of the world's largest economies and also have the highest poverty rate in the nation. Data enables us to peel back the layers, get on a granular level on how our systems are and are not yet equitably serving all of our residents and communities. But the state has historically grappled with some challenges. Various education systems, social service programs, and employment sectors in California operate independently, resulting in disconnected information and disjointed systems. Navigating the transition from early childhood to adulthood for Californians has proven to be incredibly difficult, making it hard to identify barriers and successes along the way. And there's a lack of access to data to inform better strategies. Actionable information needs to be in the hands of communities and families, the individual Californians, so that they can help identify better routes, better opportunities that lead to better outcomes for all of us. And there's a notable gap between major investments and a clear understanding of their impacts, emphasizing a need for a more informed approach. I saw a large number of our policy community here. Our state made big investments during the pandemic when we had historic budget surpluses. We all want to know what's working and what's not. What should we continue to invest in? What should be more than a one-time investment? These things are really tough for us to answer right now in California. So in response to these challenges, California enacted the Cradle-to-Career Data System Act in 2019, which set the wheels in motion for a unified solution. The California Cradle-to-Career Data System is poised to become the statewide education data system, weaving together existing education, social services, and workforce information. The overarching objective: to forge a path toward enhanced education and career outcomes for all Californians. California's investment in the Cradle-to-Career Data System has created ripples of anticipation. As C2C continues to be a priority for the governor and legislature, holding this position even through a tightening fiscal climate, this initiative doesn't solely revolve around connecting data. Its impact hinges on the productive use of this wealth of information. So how do we unlock the full potential of the Cradle-to-Career Data System? For the data system to truly propel educational and career outcomes for all residents, its development and design process must center the multifaceted needs of all of its intended users. And you achieve that through the power of user-centered design. So what is user-centered design? It's a strategic approach to product design and develop places that meets the user's needs and experiences. It puts it right at the heart of the process. So by making the user the focal point, user-centered design ensures the final product resonates deeply with its intended audience. This approach not only enhances accessibility, but boosts credibility and sustainability, creating an altogether better experience. At its core, user-centered design involves 4 key steps. And you'll see on this slide, it's a circle because it's iterative. So I'm going to say step 1, but step 1 also will become step 5. So step 1, research. We start by immersing ourselves in understanding the intended users, their aspirations, their needs, their requirements, their preferences. It's about getting into their shoes and envisioning the journey from their perspective. And then step 2, design. Armed with this insight from step 1, We then design the product to precisely match the user's needs and wants. And go to step 3, evaluate. Once the product is out there, we gather feedback from users. How is it? This invaluable input allows you to gauge if you've met their needs and identify any areas that could use improvement. Think of it as an ongoing dialogue between creators and users. And step 4, iterate. Armed with the feedback, iterate and refine the design. This dynamic process of evolution ensures that the product stays relevant and effective, adjusting to ever-changing needs of the users and the landscape. So today we're excited to introduce a new brief that dishes out recommendations for leveraging user-centered design in the California Cradle-to-Career Data Systems development. These insights are rooted in the lessons we've learned from the development of our California Post-Secondary to Prosperity Dashboard. And I'll go over a few highlights, and then we'll step into a great conversation with C2C's leadership to gain insight on their thoughts, strategies, and vision on creating a data system that works for Californians. So for those who aren't familiar, we started the Post-Secondary to Prosperity Dashboard, and thanks to ECMC Foundation and Michelson 20mm Foundation for their support on this, and recently launched an enhanced version of it. This is an interactive tool that you could find, as you see on the website or on the screen, at p2p.californiacompetes.org, or if you just go to our homepage, californiacompetes.org, you'll see in the top right corner a link to interactive map. So this interactive tool weaves data from 15 data sources to more fully understand the state of opportunity in California, who is flourishing and who is struggling, and drives conversations to help us think through what's needed to narrow the gaps. It allows Californians, researchers, practitioners, philanthropists, folks in the others that I have not read who they are yet in chat, to examine post-secondary workforce and quality of life across the state through a variety of data visualizations. So I encourage you to click on it maybe after the webinar. There are tons of thousands of data points in there. And there's also a link to a webinar we did on that dashboard's launch that provides more information on how to use all the many features embedded into the dashboard. So in building this dashboard to reveal issues of equity, we compared metrics across regions and counties by race and ethnicity, by gender, by income, and other demographics. And I will say that we really heard from our communities in thinking about what demographic information is most useful. I mean, I'm really proud of some of the disaggregations we have in there. For example, for race and ethnicity, it's more than just the main 4 or 5 racial ethnic groups we typically see, but we're able to disaggregate the Latinx and Asian diaspora to really understand, perhaps, for example, what's the difference in outcomes between Southeast Asians and South Asians. So these analyses begin to shine a spotlight on the state of opportunity in California, and are the beginning of a conversation that leads, we hope, to a transformation of our systems to better serve all residents in this state. So in every phase of creating and updating our dashboard, we harness the power of user-centered design. And I wanted to flag some examples to walk through these 4 steps before we jump into a conversation with Marianne and Ryan. So in the first step of research, we really got into understanding user needs, and we identified who our target population was for our dashboard. And we identified 4 groups: state policymakers and their staff, business leaders, civic leaders, and journalists. And we found that feedback flowed more candidly when we had listed California Competes staff or board members who were already trusted, had trusted relationships and close relationships with their target population to understand what their needs are. And this strategic approach fostered a seamless flow of open dialogues that persisted the entire development process. So think through who you're connecting to, but also who you're sending out to connect to those populations you target. Step 2, design. Through that first stage of research, we learned that key users were focused on understanding their specific region, less so statewide data. So it was important for us to curate data sets that can be drilled down to a regional or county level. And that was a priority for the dashboard. In our first iteration, we were able to get down to a region level, and our most recent update, we added more detailed county level data. Step 3, evaluate. For user testing, we cast a wide net, engaging diverse individuals from various roles, locations, levels of familiarity with education, workforce, and quality of life metrics. And this strategy enabled us to uncover data inaccuracies, correct confusing data points, boost the dashboard's engagement, and motivate users to contribute to the tool's success. And the fourth step, iterate. So beyond the launch of the dashboard, our commitment to refining didn't waver. We persistently sought user feedback to shape future enhancements. This ongoing dialogue unveiled new and expected audiences, such as funders and community-based organizations, which we did not anticipate being a main user of the dashboard. And their insights proved invaluable in steering our strategy in developing the dashboard and refining it. So by proactively engaging with these stakeholders, we're able to grasp their needs and use this knowledge to elevate the dashboard's efficacy in our most recent update. Success in my books. And we want to help support the California Cradle-to-Career Data System success as well. So we have the incredible opportunity to delve into how C2C has embraced and plans to leverage user-centered design and its ongoing efforts. So to that, we're going to transition to a conversation with Marianne and Ryan. Marianne and Ryan, I invite you to turn on your video, and I will introduce each one of them. Thank you. So Marianne Bates is the Executive Director of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System, and she is spearheading its development. Previously, she served as a Senior Fellow in the White House Office of Management and Budget, working with the Biden-Harris administration's President's Management Agenda, which is a strategic plan for operationalizing the administration's priorities. She's also formerly the Executive Director of the North America Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, known as JPAL, at MIT, which aims to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. Ryan Estrellado is the Director of Data Programs at the California Cradle-to-Career Data System. Previously, he was a Strategic Data Project Fellow at the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. He's a skilled data scientist specializing in education-related data and has over 20 years of experience in public education as a special education administrator and school psychologist. He's also the host of a podcast for educators called Donuts in the Lounge and has a great episode with Dr. Stephanie Evergreen on data visualization that I thought folks on this webinar might be particularly interested in. And I think we could share a link to that too. I highly recommend. So Marianne, Ryan, thank you for joining us this morning for, I think, a really exciting and important conversation. So I have a number of questions queued up before we turn it over to the audience Q&A. I will throw them out to both of you and let you two sort of pass the mic and jump in as you see fit. Okay, my first question is around enhancing user-centered design in the data system. How has the California Cradle-to-Career Data System integrated user-centered design principles into the development process of the data system and ensuring it resonates or will resonate with and meet the unique needs of California's many diverse users?
Thanks so much, Sujan. I can jump in and start with this. And I'll start by putting a link to a one-pager in the chat that might be a helpful resource for people as you're learning more about our work. The one-sentence answer to your question is that user-centered design is at the foundation of everything that we're doing. We're literally mandated in statute to have a focus on the users of the data system in that way. And so we're doing our best to have that shape how we plan to do this work, how we build it, and how we work with Californians in using that. So I thought what I'd do first is talk through 3 reasons why the Cradle-to-Career Data System was created. What are the 3 problems we're trying to solve, and how does that connect with our work? And then we can unpack how user-centered design feeds into each of those. So some of these, you've already alluded to. One of the first main problems that we're trying to address with the creation of this data system is that data have been siloed historically, right? You have K-12 data here, you have higher education data here, the different segments, you have employment information that's separate. And it's really hard for people, families, decision makers to bring that information together to answer important questions. Questions like, where do students in my city go after high school, right? Are we preparing them for quality jobs? Those kinds of questions require you to have information that currently sits often in very siloed places. So to address that problem, And the key thing we're doing is to build this linked analytical data set that connects existing state level data. So data that's already being collected and validated at the state level. We're linking that all together, data on education, on job outcomes, some data on health and human services, so that we get this picture from cradle to career via these linked data. And we'll make that available to people in 3 different ways, all of which will be informed by user-centered design. So one is dashboards, like the one that you just highlighted. It's intended to be an accessible way for anyone to access the information via dashboard that they can see on our website. So we'll have those on priority topics. We have those listed on our website, the ones that were mapped out during the planning process. And then the second way that people can access that information is with query builders. So essentially a choose your own adventure version of that dashboard where you can disaggregate the data, you can generate tables at a summary level and zero in perhaps in a certain geographic area, or looking at demographics and zeroing in on different student populations. So those are the query builders. And then in addition to the dashboards and the query builders, we'll also have a data request process for researchers. So that's for the researchers who want to conduct studies with the de-identified individual level data. We'll be facilitating a data request process with our data partners, where we're sort of like the common application for asking for the data points that are being shared with the data systems, and then our data providers can grant access to those data. So that's kind of problem number 1, data are siloed. We're solving that by bringing the data together, linking it, and making it available to people in ways that they find useful. And then the second problem that we're looking to address, and that we list here in the one-pager, is that students face a lot of confusing barriers, especially in the transition from high school to college. The process of applying to college, applying for financial aid, getting your transcripts from here to there, has a lot of barriers that the state wants to address and improve. And so the state has chosen to scale up 2 practical tools for students. One is California Colleges.edu, the other is eTranscript California. And we're working with our partners to expand and refine those tools for California's young people. And then the third main problem that we're aiming to address is that communities lack equitable access to useful information. And this is at the heart of today's conversation. So we need to make sure that we're doing this work by engaging with communities and listening to their needs first, before we even release products, before we develop them, and really ensuring that user-centered design is at the heart of what we're doing. And we can talk more based on your questions and what you'd like to hear as an audience, share more detail about how we're engaging with communities, how we're getting their input, and how we're planning to provide trainings and other supports to ensure that the resources we put out are actually useful and usable. And the final thing I'll just reflect on is that Cradle to Career is a fairly unique governance structure. I report to a 21-person governing board that's composed about half of our data partners, the data providers who are sharing the data with us to link it, and about half of appointees, people who represent the needs of the users of the data system. And so I answer to both of those communities, if you will, both the data providers and the end users of the data system. And that has really shaped how we've envisioned the work, how we're doing the work, and how we aim to share our progress with the public and get input all along the way. So that's kind of a few highlights from that one-pager. I think, the main point that I take away from all of this is we need to make sure we're building things that are actually useful, so that people will build them, that they'll actually visit the resources, use those dashboards, find the information helpful for the decision-making. And the only way we can do that is by listening to people and seeing how they use them and what's confusing, what isn't, and dive into that. And the second big takeaway is that a focus on equity is written into our statute that launched the office. It's what the board holds me accountable for. And if the information we put out isn't accessible to and useful for California's diverse communities, we won't have succeeded. So those are 2 of the main things that we really think about in launching this work. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, who's really spearheading a lot of, putting this user-centered design work into practice, to share more details about what this looks like for us.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Sujin, for the opportunity to join this conversation. I love conversations like this, talking about Design. Congratulations also on the release of the brief. So there's a couple of things I'll add. They're really just, it's one example, and then one additional thought about how we incorporate user-centered design in our work. And the example that comes to mind for me when I think about this goes all back maybe about a year or so. Our office was much smaller. Like we would get in these Zoom meetings and maybe have, I don't know, maybe 8 or so of the squares. This morning we had, I think, a full 16, of the squares in the Zoom that the all staff happened. So back then it was just 8, and we were being led by our director of engagement, Shannon Serrato, on a conversation about how we should be thinking about the official title of the office and also the logo design. So I think folks who have been following the project know we just released a new brand identity and logo, which was a special moment for us, but also the product of many months of user-centered design. And in that original meeting, we were sort of trying to identify our assumptions about what would resonate with the public. And one of the things that we were fairly certain of is, I don't remember who said that, might have been me. But somebody said, well, one thing we know for sure is if we say data system in the title, this is going to be a complete turnoff to the public. We want to be human in the way that we present data. So that was an assumption we kind of held. And then, of course, by way of the design process that Shannon led, we put a number of different examples and prototypes of the title and the logo out to folks in our public events, but then also through surveys and interviews and stuff like that, and began to process the conversation around these different examples. And one of the surprising things that we discovered is that folks actually want a data system in the title and the logo. Hence, you can sort of see there the final product actually has that in there. And the basic idea is like folks, what resonated with folks is the idea of the clarity of what our project is about. The takeaway here is that a really well-run design process, like the one that Shannon led, is one that comes from curiosity and this basic assumption that this is a process of discovering what it is that the public needs and wants, what they want to think and feel as they use our products, as they experience our brand identity. Certainly, as professionals, we have assumptions about that, but the basic idea is we have to pressure test those assumptions and experience the delight of discovering when those assumptions are wrong and get closer and closer to the truth of what's going to resonate with the public. And so I really like that story. It's also just practical tip, for all of the designers joining today. If you don't already, collect all your prototypes along the way. When you arrive months later and a year later at your final product and you're celebrating it, it's neat to kind of look at the different versions of what you had developed and that becomes its own story of how you've grown and discovered what works. Last thing I'll say here is if we think of equity as creating opportunities for people to participate in the process that historically haven't had a chance to participate, you can then see for very practical reasons why user-centered design can be a powerful tool for equity, because at every stage of the design process that Sujin described earlier, research and the prototyping and iteration, evaluation, those steps, each of those is an opportunity to be very thoughtful about who you invite into that process to co-design with you. That choice is on us to be able to make thoughtfully and in light of who's been invited to that conversation historically and how that's led to the products that we have currently, where we want to go into the future, and the voices that we need and the stories represented in what we build. So every step of the way as we design things is a very tangible opportunity to work towards equity, which I think is really great. In that sense, you can have equity as a central design principle explicitly stated, or it can be one that just exists alongside other certain main design principles. So that's something that was super important to us. We talk about that all the time. And I think if we structure that in the process, we say it explicitly, then it's a lot easier to hold ourselves accountable for making sure that that's a part of it.
Well, congrats on the new brand and the official name. I love it. You both said a couple of things I wanted to elevate a little bit. Marianne, you talked about the governance structure and the way that with the governing board and the advisory boards, like the very intentional design to include users and to make sure those voices are very formally, a part of um, the data system in the office and the work that you do. And thinking, one thing I should have flagged is I sit on the governing board of the data system, and I think as I am one of the appointees from the Assembly Speaker, and in that process, one of the things that I thought was really valuable for me to discuss was not only my role as leading a policy and research organization that will do advocacy using the data as a research org that would use the data, but also as a parent in my local district, sitting on my district's LCAP committee and trying to access data to make, advise our district on how best to serve, high need students in our district. I'm thinking about those design elements too. And just the challenges that we face as parents trying to do right by our children in the state. So thank you for that. And then Ryan, you had mentioned the use of data system in the name. And I think one thing when we talk to people about user-centered design, I think the response is typically, well, why, like, duh, like, why, what kind of design, what's non-user-centered design? But I think the amount of work that goes into doing this process really thoughtfully. And I think the willingness to go into it thinking, realizing like we might be wrong, as you went into it, or not perhaps you, Ryan, but maybe you, Ryan, but thinking like, oh, look, we were wrong, and to be open to sort of like that, to learning that there might be a better way to do something that you hadn't, as the expert, realized. So I'm curious, I think, to hit home sort of why it's sort of valuable to put this incredible amount of work to do a user-centered design process. If there were any things, like maybe one thing or two things, like in the development process so far, like what sort of other insights had you not foreseen, or issues or sort of revelations, ahas, have emerged from doing this process? I think that will maybe help folks who are still grappling with why do this? You're the experts, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Is the moments of discovering things that are unexpected they're pretty frequent. If I think like kind of like you mentioned, CJ, if you're sort of open to that and you expect it, it's kind of becomes a signal of, or I've taken it to become a signal of that we're on the right path. When we're sort of becoming less and less wrong about our assumptions on a particular design, problem that we're trying to solve. I think we're building products for the public, and the public, people's stories are complicated. I think in order to process and understand and draw themes and stuff, we kind of, as human beings, we tend to simplify things, put them into categories, and that's useful. But ultimately, the more and more you dig into people's stories, what we realize is the inherent complexity of people's stories. They're just, and they're just so different, and that's, I think that's a pretty obvious truth. And so, one example I could think of that was surprising to us, pleasantly surprising, is we had one of the key products that came out of the initial planning process was the development of multiple user personas. So these are descriptions that were stories built off of many interviews that were done in the 18-month planning process that preceded the standing up of our office. And that helped us think broadly about who we build products for. So some examples are researchers and analysts, families are another example, policy planners is another example. And these are great. These personas end up being really great tools for us because they give us language to design around and hold ourselves accountable for not, what I think of as when I do design wrong, basically what I'm doing is I'm designing for myself. I have an idea in my head and I try to design that, right? And the personas help us sort of get out of that. And as we took those personas and we began to build on them, what we realized is, okay, that persona, that set of personas that we have tackles one dimension, which is, the role that we take on as people using the data system. That's sort of the way you would think of when we describe things like researchers or a family member or a policymaker. But of course, as I was trying to point out earlier, the lives of anybody in Californians, who are the folks that we're building for, they're complicated. And so we began to look at another dimension of the persona, which is how often one uses data. And we kind of like that now because we have the second axis to think about, are you a researcher who uses data all the time or just, moderately? Are you a family member who uses data only a little bit or all the time? Researchers, for example, are family members too. Policy planners are also family members. Researchers are also, policy planners. So there's this inherent complexity that we're constantly trying to build mental models around and say, how do we meet the needs of folks like that and allow for these experiences to be, to show up in our work. And so a key discovery for us that we completely had not planned on discovering is this idea of a data ambassador as a persona, which could be a research analyst or a policymaker or a family member. But we've discovered that there are members of the community who, number one, very interested in data, are very likely to use the products that we build. Number two, are highly regarded within their community and relied upon to interpret data and general findings for a community that maybe, for a variety of reasons, won't be spending a ton of time with the data, but they've got these one or two people who are kind of the ambassadors of that information. And so this is a persona that we think about a lot, that allows for a lot of complexity in the way that we think of who this person is, because they're not limited to just being an analyst or a family member or an educator or practitioner. And so big lesson there that we've learned, I hope we continue on into the future as we design things, is that as many mental models as we can sort of come up with to describe just how complex the lives are of the people who live in this state, we really want to do that. And I think one other thing I'll say on this topic that was a surprising discovery is that when you are serving a population as large as Californians, you can't go and you can't interview every single person, right? It's just not possible. And interviewing and getting input during the design process is critical. So then that was the question that we had, how do we get to the right people? And the very pleasant discovery was that we have our governing board and our two advisory boards, community engagement, data and tools, very deliberately selected because of the communities that they represent, both professionally and also personally. And so now whenever we recruit for interviews and surveys and co-design and stuff like that, our first stop very often is to connect with our advisory and governing board members to ask them, who do you think that we should be talking to? And that helps us narrow down representative groups of people who can help us get diverse coverage across the state of California. So the sort of surprising discovery there is, if you're serving a lot of people, you need an intermediary sometimes to be able to help you deliver on the promise of speaking to the right folks.
Thanks, Ryan. So I really appreciate that. And I'm thinking last week we were with our friends at Spitfire Strategies, and one thing that they had said was the general public is not a target audience. Like try again. So I think that when you said that, you can't, if you think about comms and engagement, you cannot target the general public, particularly in a state that's as diverse as California. And then the data ambassador. When you said that, it resonated. I'd mentioned my role with my district's LCAP committee, which advises around, spending in our district. And I feel like our data ambassador, my often go-to are friends at Go Public Schools. And I will say but they dig into our district's data and they put out very accessible publications, and I trust them as, a mom. So thinking about that piece, and I'm a mom who's pretty data savvy. So even still, I spend enough of my volunteer time with that. I love that. And you put a nice segue into one of my questions around who should we be talking to? And I'm going to jump to that question around sort of the outreach efforts of your work. Are there any audiences that have proven challenging to get in touch with or engage with that you've already identified as an important population, target use case population? And I wanted to flag that if you could share that with us, because we have I think, 100 something people on the call, over 300 people who registered, who hopefully will watch the recording. And I would love if participants on the call could offer their perspectives in the chat and brainstorm ideas on how we can collectively enhance outreach to these communities to ensure their valuable input shapes the data system effectively. So if you want to share that, and people can put thoughts in chat or reach out to you directly also outside this if they have any ahas after this, after the next 20 minutes.
Thanks so much. I can start answering that, and Ryan, please feel free to jump in as well. And I can also try to address, I was trying to answer some of the Q&A in real time here, wondering who did we reach out to during the planning process? Who are reaching out now? So during the 18-month planning process that preceded the launch of our office, WestEd led an in-depth planning process that had over 100 public meetings. And because it launched, that planning process started right around the time of the pandemic kicking off, all of those meetings moved to Zoom, and people could join from wherever they were and didn't have to come to Sacramento for that. So I know there was a concerted effort to make sure that practitioners from all different areas, right? So from early learning and care to K-12 to higher ed, and those thinking about workforce development issues and all of that were included in those conversations. Taking a step back and thinking about our governance structure as well, in addition to the governing board that Sujin sits on, as she mentioned, these advisory boards as well. So we have two 16-person advisory boards. The governing board appoints those. And this year we received well over 100 applications for 11 spots. So a third of the seats turn over each year. And as our office supported the governing board and selecting from among those applicants to make the appointments, we tried to make sure that the application form and the information that people were invited to share help the governing board take into account things like region that people work in or where they're from, the roles that they play, whether they're a student or whether they're a practitioner working in schools, or whether they're a researcher, or whether they're community working with a community organization or an advocate, and thinking about all of those different roles and perspectives. And the governing board has done their best to try to ensure that those advisory boards reflect the diversity of California. There have been, your question, Sujin, was like, have there been challenges? So just as one example, last year, when the governing board made the first appointments, we had almost no applications from students. And we knew that was an issue. The governing board saw that as an issue. And so over the last year, our team did a lot of work to reach out to different entities who could help get the word out about these advisory board vacancies to different student organizations and reach out to students. And so this year we had more of those applications, and we're able to add two additional students to the advisory boards. So that's one example of what I'm sure all of you on this call know well, is that it's not enough to just say, here's an opportunity, the application's open, and then wait to see what comes in the door. We really try to pair that with proactive outreach through our governing board, through our advisory boards, through the many different organizations who've been following this work closely to get as much reach as we can. There are other things. So for example, tribal communities, we don't have representation from those, to my knowledge, on our advisory boards right now. So that's something that we're looking to do more proactive outreach on. And then for this call in particular as well, I think the perspective of industry, employers, and really thinking about from cradle to career being the full scope of our work, having the perspectives of those of you who bring that perspective in our work from the beginning is incredibly important as well. I think historically in the planning process, we've probably had a bit more input from those in higher education or K-12 education than industry and employment. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and California Competes hosting this conversation too. Ryan, is there anything you would add to that?
I totally agree with it. Students is also a group that came to mind to me. And I think the something I'll add to that is last year when we did our first student experience audit, which is a research project to uncover the barriers that students experience when they apply for college and financial aid. One group of students that we heard a lot about are students with what we came to describe as special custodial circumstances. So they either moved, they didn't have a steady residence because they were moving through foster homes or something like that, or in some cases, the student was undocumented or family members were undocumented. And within the process of applying for college and financial aid, there are numerous requests for information about household income, family members, and stuff like that. And what we learned from that process is students can be, not all the time, but students can be hard to reach in this process of wanting to invite them to participate in the design process. But the reason was surprising, or one that we hadn't expected, which is that to participate in any sharing of information is it's a vulnerable act for a number of reasons, right? There are students who just were not comfortable sharing the information because of the risk that it might fall on them by sharing that story, or on their family members. There are some students who didn't know where that information was. It just wasn't in the system is not sort of optimizing for it. Well, let me say it this way: the system optimizes for folks who have ready access to that information, maybe have folks in previous generations who have also gone through that process, so they sort of know where all that is, and maybe the custodial circumstances fairly straightforward, so there's less risk in sharing it. So I think the lesson here is that there are a lot of reasons why some folks could be hard to reach. Some of them are because of self-preservation, or wanting to progress in a way that doesn't put themselves at risk. It's not always that folks don't want to participate. And so from our point of view, it's on us to create ways to design with us and give input that are safe and is respectful of that point of view. And that also, in turn requires us to do a lot of listening and learning and understanding what those points of view are, and then to be able to design ways to communicate that respect that.
Thank you. Well, I see we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to wrap up our questions with one last one, which I think we'll probably tackle some of those, I'm guessing. So in your work engaging Californians around the launch of the data system, Marianne, I saw you just put in a link to frequently asked questions around the data points. Are there other frequently asked questions that come up, or anything like that you'd like to take this opportunity to clarify for the folks and perhaps data ambassadors on this call? And maybe this will address some of the Q&A too, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Sure, I'll start with a few, and then I'm sure Ryan has some as well. So one common misconception is whether we're collecting data directly at Cradle-to-Career. And the answer to that is no. So we are bringing together and linking data that's already collected at the state level. So I answered one of the questions in the chat. So higher education data, right? We're working with the chancellor's offices, right? UCOP, to get data that they're already collecting on higher education at the system level. And our work is to work really closely with those data providers to link their data, to make sure that they help us understand the nuances of it, and that we do that well. So one is, we don't collect the data directly. The second question that I also saw in the chat that I wanted to address is, how often are we receiving the data? So there's two answers to this question. For the analytical data that we've been discussing, this linked data set that we're bringing together, the answer right now is annually. So we're planning to get the first data submissions this fall. And then after that, March each year is when we expect to get data for the prior academic year from our data providers. So I think that's really important for people to understand. That's about this retrospective analysis of what's happened in the past. And it won't be real time because it takes time for those state level entities to collect the data, validate it, share it with us, for us to link it, and then make it available in the dashboards. So the answer to that question is once a year, we'll get the data in March, and then we'll take some time after that to update our dashboards and make it available through those mechanisms. The second part to that question is for those practical tools we mentioned, like California Colleges.edu, which is a platform for enabling applications to colleges. They do have more real-time data integrations across K-12 entities and some of our higher education entities like CSU, for example, where they do have more real-time data exchanges that help people like college counselors have real-time information about which students they can support in finishing their college applications or finishing up their financial aid applications. So the answer looks different for the practical tools and for the analytical data. Ryan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, one thing that I think we can't say enough, particularly at this stage of development, is the idea of individual data versus aggregated data. So we link all of the data the way Marianne described at an individual level. That's sort of what gives the analytic power of the data set that we're building. But what is given to the public in the form of data tools is all aggregated. So in other words, the tools are used to explore larger patterns and not at all to identify any one particular person. And so that's all. I think it's really important to say, because we're in a trust building process. We need to be able to understand the value that the public wants to receive from the tools that we're building, and simultaneously store that data securely and ensure that that what we are talking about here are larger patterns or research questions that we have, and not the sort of tracking and following of individual groups. And there's all numerous ways in which we honor that promise, but it's something that we kind of find ourselves making sure to to clarify with the public whenever we talk about the tools that we're building.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn now to those that joined us live during this webinar who had questions. There's a lot of questions in here, so hopefully we'll get through as many as we can, and maybe we could send some over to you, Marianne and Ryan, to see if you guys can answer them via, I don't know, words, written words that we'll include when we send out the recording. Great, and maybe I'll just start. There's a couple that Carolyn from our Cal Competes team have tagged to answer live, and then I'll maybe just prioritize those that are more maybe more qualitatively a conversation focused, and those that are sort of like less that you guys could get a firm answer on. So first one, early bird gets the worm in questions, anonymous attendee right off the bat. A question around after school programs data. Will that be included in the Cradle-to-Career Data System?
I could take that one. So at present, we don't have after schools data as a data point that is in our participation agreement. With any data point that is not in the participation agreement, usually what we do is a lot of thinking about whether or not there's a proxy, if there's interest from the public in that particular data point. We ask ourselves whether or not there is a reasonable proxy data point that we already do have that could approximate what the desired data point, the story that it tells. And in cases where there isn't, then we're always open to conversation about the use case for that, and also where that data might come from. And a big part of our development process is to field those questions and consider them. So I think if there's interest in something like that, we could always use our regular process to consider it.
Yeah. And if I can add to that, one thing that's top of mind right now is these advisory boards, as Ryan was alluding to, have an annual cycle of making recommendations to our governing board. So there's kind of informal and formal ways for ideas to come to our data system. Lots of informal opportunities through public comment at our major meetings, or we host these informal community conversations, Zoom events periodically. But then each of our 32 advisory board members have opportunities to propose formal recommendations that they then prioritize and finalize as advisory boards, and then bring to the governing board once annually. So our Data and Tools Advisory Board and our Community Engagement Advisory Board are right now putting together proposals for recommendations that go to our governing board. So that's a formal mechanism through which ideas on a wide range of topics, including specific data areas that you think would be very helpful to see, can come to us and our governing board.
Great. So right now would be the time for those that are interested in data that is not currently on the list to be included, to reach out to advisory board members around this, or I guess the governing board members too. Great. And I see Garrett Jensen's comment about that the state is spending over $4 billion a year on after-school programs. So perhaps could be a priority for this. And to Marian's earlier comment, I think one piece is also that this data is being collected by one of the data providers as a key part, since the California Cradle-to-Career Data System itself would not collect new data. So we, to make sure the data already exists for it to be included in the California Cradle-to-Career Data System, right? Great. Let's go to the next question. Will you be creating API connectivity for others to access and integrate live data into our own dashboard? And can you talk a little bit about what API connectivity means?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, that what this is referring to is some method by which somebody else who is creating a dashboard that is different from ours can connect make a connection to the P20W data set, and then also use that data to build a dashboard or presumably other products. And right now, the answer to the question is no. We're really focused on developing and maintaining a secure way to move data from our partners into our sort of central data warehouse, and then securing that data and making it available to the products that we're building. And at present, there aren't any plans to build an API that would sort of let others talk to it. And there's sort of a number of reasons for that. But right now, the focus is on bringing in data from our partners and then making that available to the public by way of the tools.
Great, thank you. Speaking of making data available to partners, a question came in from someone who's working with a nonprofit that is working with students. How can nonprofits, or can they get access to data on the students that they're serving to assess, their program impacts?
Go ahead, Ryan, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
I think I'll start by saying, as Ryan mentioned, the analytical data won't allow members of the public, for sure, right, to zoom in and see individual level data. And the same is true, the research request process will be for de-identified data. But there's the research request process, as we've envisioned it currently, is open to researchers. And the key question will be, what's the research question that the person wants to answer, and what ability do they have to keep individual level data safe and confidential? So I think for that one, I would recommend saying stay tuned. If you look at the 12-month work plan that I just put in the chat and the 5-year timeline, you'll see that developing the details of the process for requesting individual level data is on our plate for this coming fiscal year to develop that, and then finalizing that, which will make it a bit easier for you to understand what's possible for that individual level data for research purposes. But taking a step back, our hope is that the query builder, where any member of the public can disaggregate the dashboards and zoom in on it, will be able to answer a lot of the questions that nonprofits, organizations, advocates have bigger picture. And those query builders will allow disaggregation by geographic area or by student characteristic, with the restriction that you'll never be able to see data in a cell for fewer than 30 people at a time. So that's kind of the granularity of that.
Thank you. And there were 2 questions that I think get to a similar vein and really tie into this topic. So I think we'll wrap up with this one. Curious about how you engage community members to receive input. So one question was around the environment. So conference rooms, classrooms, was it their place or yours? And then I feel like on a similar vein, what were your methods for hearing what the community wanted to see in the data set? What type of people did you ask in what forums? And I know we only have like 1 minute left, so I guess a brief response.
I can try to do the 30-second version. During the planning process, because it was during the pandemic, my understanding is almost all of that was virtually and via Zoom, with an intent to reach as many communities as possible. So there was a structured way of engaging with K-12 versus higher education versus practitioners. Our plans moving forward include continuing to make sure our meetings are all available for public comment engagement virtually, combined with traveling the state and meeting people where they are. So that's something we would like to do.
Great. And are you interested in having any hosts? Like if people on this webinar are interested in hosting, maybe they could reach out and let you know that they'd love to have you in their community and can help you set up something that's.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. We would very much appreciate that and welcome recommendations. And if you would like us to come visit you or speak at your event or meet with your communities, we'd be more than happy to do that.
Great. And there are a lot of questions about what is in the data system or will be and what will not be, and thoughts about what should be. Is there a good place for those folks to share? We will share those with you and then get some of these answers back out to folks that registered. But I imagine there are probably many, many more. Should these folks join like a data and tools advisory committee meetings, or what's the best way for people to stay continually involved after this webinar?
If you sign up on our website for our newsletter, you'll get alerts for all of our public meetings, as well as these informal community conversations. So I would recommend the upcoming Data and Tools Advisory Board meeting. That's October 12th, I believe, of this year. Will be specifically focused on the recommendations that advisory board is bringing forward, which could include additional data points or different ways of looking at the data. So that one might be particularly of interest. And then the community conversations provide a more open and informal opportunity to share ideas with us as well. So that's one way to keep in touch. We also have a blog where we try to share as much information as we can on the kinds of questions we're most frequently getting, and being transparent about what we have and what we don't have yet, or what is feasible or not yet feasible.
Great. And Carolyn just put in the chat ways to stay involved, the link to the Cradle-to-Career Data Systems website. Well, thank you so much. I know we're a little bit over, and I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but please, I feel like folks join the advisory committee meetings, join the governing board meetings, ask for questions. Feel free to reach out to me. I see Marianne and Ryan are also open to further conversation, and maybe we'll do this again. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.